here. We are going to get started. I want to keep us on a good time schedule here. We're going to do about 20 minutes of presentation, about 10 minutes of questions, Q&A. And so I'd like to introduce Mackenzie Patton from UCCE, based out of Placerville, who's going to speak with us today about integrated pest management and foothill crop production. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Just out of curiosity, who is familiar with UC Cooperative Extension? Okay, so almost everybody. So I just want to give that a quick rundown. Basically, the federal and state give funding to the UC system to provide a liaison between university, research, and the agricultural production. And so I am a cooperative extension advisor in our counties. I cover El Dorado all the way down to Tuolumne. And there's a couple other advisors in our area. There's a woody mass advisor. Dan Macon is a livestock advisor. There's Hardeep Singh, who's also a local food systems advisor. And I think and Scott Minetto, and he's based out of Amador. We all have different offices, but we cover this region, and we're here to help growers in any way that they need help. We're a free resource because we get federal and state funding to supply help to producers. So just wanted to give that little pitch, make sure everyone knew where we were. So we're just going to be talking about what integrated pest management is and how our unique landscape will play into that plant production. And I'm going to focus on plant production because that's my background. So what is integrated pest management? Integrated pest management is an ecosystem-based strategy that focuses on sustainable long-term prevention of pests with using a combination of techniques that minimize human and environmental risks. In general, this is considered to be a cycle, kind of starting off with prevention, the idea of putting the right plants in the right location, thinking about where you're going to put them, making sure that your soil and your water are appropriate for that plant. Then we move into, if you do have a pest problem or a disease problem, making sure you identify it correctly, and this has to go into play because the management strategies may vary drastically depending on the different species or types. Then it goes into monitoring. There's different ways you can do this. There's physical traps, there's weed counts, there's monitoring of the weather to know when to spray for diseases or if to spray for diseases. Then there goes into what we call the decision making or the action threshold. So this is where you know the limit, the amount of damage that's acceptable or not, and when you reach that limit, that's when you start implementing maybe other pest management strategies as opposed to the base level. And so there's a lot of different, that decision making step will trigger whether or not you go into the action phase. In the action phase, there's a ton of different types of integrated pest management strategies that exist for growers, which we'll go into in a second. And those are actual actions that you can take to prevent pest damage. And then finally, to bring it all back around, anytime you do any sort of pest management strategy, or really honestly on a farm, anytime you do anything different, you should evaluate, see how that did. Was that beneficial? Did it reduce pests? Did it increase yield? That kind of thing. This is a huge step in the IPM process because without evaluating, who knows how well that technique that you applied or employed was useful or not. So I mentioned there's a lot of different types of tactics. So this is what's called the tactics pyramid. Starting off, the idea is to start at the base and implement from the bottom up, in which way you're reserving more impactable, potentially impactful products like chemical products. You're reserving that for if you have severe outbreaks or you're going to have economic losses that will impact your bottom line, so you might want to implement those chemical choices. So some examples, I mentioned prevention. Again, this is making sure that your water source is appropriate. You don't have anything weird going on in your water. It has to do with making sure you're taking proper horticultural care in terms of any amendments to the soil and that nature. Cultural is things like crop rotation and sanitation, cleaning up mummies, cleaning up crop mummies that are left over, cleaning up crop debris so that they don't harbor diseases for the next year. Then we have mechanicals such as pruning and mowing. The next step is biological. This includes any biocontrols that are microorganism based, like applying beneficial microbes to prevent disease, or using natural enemies like parasitoids, which can cut down on the pests that you might be experiencing. And then, like I said, lastly, you reserve chemical use for only when it's necessary for you not to have complete crop loss. So we're going to move into why are the Sierras different? Why is this area different? Just a little bit about, we all know the Sierra. This is mainly about the foothill areas on the west side, obviously, because that's what that map is. That was defined by the California Forest Pest Control. That's the Sierra foothills AVA, which AVAs are determined by the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms government agency, that they're wine regions. So one of the first things that makes the foothills different is we have microclimates. Microclimates can drastically change from a very short distance as compared to when you're farming somewhere that's flat and at a stable elevation. So the biggest fluctuation is from elevation, but of course there's directional slopes, the wind patterns and how the wind drainage of the area. There are human structures that will go into play that will either could make a place warmer if you have more man-made structures, as well as trees can provide wind blocks, messing with that wind pattern, which can really affect microclimates in our region. So here's just some examples of microclimates that do exist. In the foothills, we have a lot of water sources nearby. There are reservoirs or draining swells. They might be creeks or rivers. Obviously, water is one of those things that temperate. The temperature, it either can make it stay slightly warmer or stay slightly cooler. And that's because water has a high, what's called a high specific heat. So it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of water. So water can be like a buffer. So the closeness to water on your property can adjust the microclimate that you might experience in terms of temperature as well as obviously humidity. One of the most obvious ones is the north-south facing slopes. Most everyone knows south facing slopes, way more sun. You're going to want sun-loving plants there. And then one that's very specific to the foothills is the valleys and the frost pocket sinks. So you get air drainage down into these sinks, and the warm air is moving up because that's what warm air does. And so when you get this inversion, there'll be what's called a thermal belt, where this area is actually warmer. But then here, because all that warm air rose up and all the cold air sunk in, is where you get frost pockets. And so when ultimately the important concept with microclimates is it's gonna change in effect where certain plants can and can't be planted. These are just examples. We're going to kind of go into a little overall example. Let's say this is your land, south-facing slope, north-facing slope. So on that south-facing slope that gets more sun, maybe we'll put in some olives. There's going to be good drainage down. Olives can handle that heat, and they're not at a risk for freezing. The valley has that freezing point, and so you want to put something that's a little more frost-tolerant. Grapes tend to be more frost tolerant, but as some of you may know, we have had some pretty bad frost with grapes. So you still might have to implement techniques to minimize frost, such as movement of air, like putting a wind turbine in, or something like that in a certain situation for your grapes. And then lastly, let's say we put on that north-facing slope apples, because apples have a lot of variety their varieties have a lot of variability, and they tend to be more cold tolerant. They can do well on that north-facing slope, but there are some varieties that may mature quicker or earlier in the season, which might be necessary because if they're getting less sun, it might take them longer to mature. So you need something that ripens earlier so that it's ripe in time for harvest before the end of the year. So this is just one example of how a microclimate will change where and how crops are going to be put in. Now, the good thing is, our area, we grow a lot of specialty crops, which a specialty crop is just high-value crops grown on small acreage. So generally speaking, it's not like corn that's mass-produced, right? That's not considered a high-value crop, or wheat is not considered a high-value crop. Now, the good thing is, specialty crops thrive in niche microclimates. Some examples of this, lavender and figs, while they do, they're a little sensitive to frost, they do really well in our more rocky soils, and they have good drainage, which can be good for those south-facing slopes in areas where maybe the soil is not too deep, so you can't put something that needs deep soil, but figs and lavender will do great there. Blueberry is a good example. They like cold tolerant, they're very cold tolerant, and they like acidic soils, which depending on your elevation, if you have got a lot of pine trees, you have acidic soil. And then lastly, like I mentioned, apples are a good one just because they need some amount of cold time, which a lot of our areas in the foothills have some cold, but there's a lot of variability in the individual varieties that need certain aspects to thrive. So you can find a variety that will thrive in your area. Okay, very quickly we'll talk a little bit about watersheds and how our watersheds will make irrigation and crop production different than, say, in the valley. So real quick, what is a watershed? It's literally just all of the water, all of the land in an area where the water in that area will drain into one place. So it covers not just the actual bodies of water, but all of the areas around that are going to drain into those. These are just some examples in our area. Now, the difference that we have is we have a lot of watersheds in general, right? Because we're up a little bit higher in the mountains, so there's a lot of different water sources and supplies. So this is kind of a little bit of a difference between a valley and Sierra foothill water production, or water source, right? And why watersheds are important is because you need to know your source. You need to know if you have something weird in your water, which for the most part we don't, because we've got a lot of good water sources for the most part. You need to know if you're getting it well, if you're on a city municipal sources, of course flood risk, and then a lot of watersheds and municipalities will have certain environmental regulations that go into, like, for example, a setback of a certain distance from any water source. So just some of the big differences. One of the big differences is because we have more slopes, that means the water is going to go down quicker, which means, because gravity's pulling it down, which means the substrates and soils and rocks are going to get pulled more, so you have higher erosion risk. And that also means you're going to get sediment deposition, varying sediment deposition at those bottom areas where it's gathering. So a couple of reasons why this is important in plant production: nutrient and pesticide runoff. So again, because that water's going down with gravity, it's going to be pulled more quickly, and this can cause any agricultural input, whether it be manure, whether it be natural manure, whether it be synthetic manure, whether it be a pesticide. It's going to get, let's say you put some on your corn here, it's going to move more quickly down the soil and into water supplies, which is bad. The nutrient runoff can cause things like algae blooms and disrupt those microorganisms in water. So one of the ways that people combat this is they have these buffer strips of natural plants, and those natural plants will pick up that excess fertilizer runoff. And so one of the big differences between here and the valley is we have a higher risk of causing surface runoff contamination, so we can cause the local streams and things to have more contamination. Versus in the valley, they have groundwater contamination because all of their stuff sinks into those aquifers. And so a lot of their pooled water that they're pulling out of the ground tends to have more contamination issues than we do. But we can cause ecological problems with the runoff going down all of our small creeks and rivers. And again, this affects the runoff and the erosion risk, and this just, again, has to go with that speed pulling down. And as I mentioned, it can cause this varying composition, which we'll talk about in a second. So just some examples of things that people might have to implement in order to deal with this erosion risk and the runoffs. Or terracing, low to no-till farming, because tilling increases erosion risk, and or using buffer strips like I mentioned. So the terracing really just slows that water down, so you're not pulling the soil as quickly. We'll talk very briefly again about terrain. Cool, thank you. So in general, our soils are more shallow, and they have less subsoil and surface soil components to them. Now, the downside is this: it's shallow, it's more shallow, so if you have things that need the deep soil, it's a little bit harder. Another downside is there's variability over short ranges, and of course that higher erosion risk. Now the upside is we generally don't have salinity or waterlogging issues. Now this is a caveat because there's variability, so some of those areas, some of the soil types might have some waterlogging issues, but salinity is hardly ever an issue in our area. The other part that is nice is because we have this variability in soil types, the difference in particle size minimizes the compaction that will happen. And so when you have different compositions that make it up, it's not going to get compressed down and compact, which means that it'll be easier for plants to break up the soil and grow. And then because it's not that deep, it's not as deep and it's variable, there's sometimes there are lower pest pressures because pests won't take over giant swaths of an area. So this is just an example. So I picked 5,000 acres in, I think it's like South El Dorado County, or no, and 5,000 acres in San Joaquin, sorry. You can see San Joaquin, there's 47% of something, of this soil type, and this is from the USDA Web Soil Survey, which I'll have as a resource, but 47% of this one type, 35% of this other type. This is 5,000 acres, just randomly picked in El Dorado County. This is its soil composition.
Oh, thanks.
So 5,000 acres is a big amount that I picked there, but you can see it's a lot of different, and most of it's a few percentages. I think there's like a 25, there's a 24% here. That's like the biggest, but it's very variable over a certain distance, which can make deciding what to put where more challenging. All right. Lastly, you have environmental and sustainability factors. Pest pressures will differ, and this can be a good thing in many ways. I would say it's a better thing than it is a downside, because large-scale industrial valley production, they may have more outbreaks of certain diseases because they have monolithic monocultures across large distances, which could cause these diseases and outbreaks more often. Another caveat that we have is a lot of pests and diseases won't survive over the winter, especially in some of the places that get colder. Now, the downside is we often have more issues with wildlife, and it's funny, I know sapsuckers are much more, they're still a small problem, but they're much more of a problem here than they are down in the valley. And of course, deer are a problem if you don't have deer fence. And bear are really funny because I've had grape growers tell me that bears have a particular favorite type of grape. They like Movedra grapes, apparently. And then of course, mountain lions are a problem if you have livestock. And then lastly, our culture of sustainability is different. So this is a survey of Amador that I did in Amador with growers. And we all know that like the US culturally has shifted to more sustainable practices. And when I asked the growers how to describe their management practices, so 75% of them were sustainable. And what that just means is a lot of them do the best they can to be organic, but they're not certified. One, because it's expensive, and only about a quarter of them consider themselves conventional. So I think that's important for everyone to know moving forward when it comes to how they're marketing and how policies will play into management practices. So just tying it all together, microclimates affect where certain plants or varieties may be planted. We have a lot of water sources, but we have to be careful at what we put into our systems because of those runoff risks. Our soils are shallow, and that can affect, and because they're variable, it can affect the efficacy of agricultural inputs, because some things hold on to clay particles much better, and so if you have more clay or you have less clay, it may change how well whatever product is that you're putting in. Of course, the seasonality and severities may shift due to elevation. You might start seeing things earlier or later, depending on where you're at. And culturally, our markets are more sustainable. So all of this goes into play when it comes to the policies that affect growers. So I know, for example, the state has required growers to get their wells tested, and a lot of my growers have complained about that. But it's because in the Central Valley, they were getting their well waters tested, and they were coming back with high ammonia levels because of water runoff. And so it's interesting how the differences between our agriculture, we get affected by sometimes the policies that are applied for the rest of agriculture, even if they don't necessarily apply to us. So it's important to know these so that you can speak up for your policymakers in your area. Just a couple of resources, obviously RCDs, which I know the Amador RCD person, but we'll be talking later. UCIPM is the program, one of the programs that I work for. So it is Integrated Pest Management under the UC Agricultural and Natural Resources umbrella. And then that's just where you can get that web soil survey, and they have it for everywhere. You just plug in an address and they'll give you an estimate of the type of soil you have. There's my contact, and yeah, if you guys have any questions, I'd love to field.
4 minutes for questions.
Sweet.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, any questions? I know it's a lot of stuff, but just want to reiterate, me and the other UCCE advisors are more than happy to field questions any of the time if you have questions. My background is disease and pest management. So I studied insects and plant diseases, but we have expertise throughout. So yes.
Do you make site visits?
We do.
And I just reach out to you for that?
Yep. Yeah.
Do you connect farmers with the product that you are going to recommend? Like if you recommend a biological product, can you help farmers source that and they know what they need?
We can tell you sources of it. Generally, we try to focus on saying an active ingredient, so we might tell you this biological product, but maybe not the trade name. And that's just because we're state, so we try not to point to one product or another. But we will tell you the active ingredient. Yes.
To like kind of piggyback off of what you're saying, the climate action, Community Alliance of Family Farms.
Yes.
There is a lady, Hannah Call, she's actually currently on maternity leave, but she is an integrated pest management researcher for CAP. But they do grants specifically for like habitat restoration and pollinators, and that's where she really gets in as an advisor for IPM. So I think like you can leverage Mackenzie, and then
I can also make those connections.
Yeah.
CAP. So CAP is really active in the Sacramento area, and I've been working with them. I just got approval for a grant with them for stone fruit, but I'm trying to bring them more out here because we have so many small. So it's Community Alliance with Family Farms, so it's all small farms focused, and we have so many, and because a lot of their staff, they do a lot of great work, but most of them are in the valley. So I've been trying to get them up into the foothills more. So that's definitely something I've been working with them on. We're also trying to get together almost like a new farm workshop. It's more like focused on management, irrigation management, pest management. Dan Macon is really good at like market information because he has his own, he does animal production, but he knows how to deal with farmers markets and things like that. So we've been trying to get resources for next year going for that. But yeah, CAF is a great resource. I should have thrown it on my resource slide. Any other questions?
All right.
Perfect.
Thank you, Mackenzie.
Thanks.